Politics and science collide at the White House.
I would like you to speak to the medical doctors to see if there's any way that you can apply light and heat to cure.
The president's statements lead to tensions with medical professionals.
Deborah, have you ever heard of that?
That is a treatment.
And in the states, unease about the economy as another stimulus bill is signed.
States should declare bankruptcy? That's how you're going to bring this national economy back? By states declaring bankruptcy? You want to see that market fall through the cellar? Let New York State declare bankruptcy.
Plus, growing outrage as some governors push to reopen.
Today, we are announcing plans to incrementally and safely reopen sectors of our economy.
I would tell him not to just turn the switch on and go.
Next.
This is Washington Week. Once again from Washington, moderator Robert Costa.
Good evening. As the death toll in the United States surges past 50,000 people, President Trump's assertions about how to treat the novel coronavirus continue to roil his administration. And just hours ago, the president took no questions at the latest briefing following a week of tensions between him and health experts. Joining me to discuss these issues are reporters who have been on these big stories all week. Nancy Cordes, chief congressional correspondent for CBS News. Toluse Olorunnipa, White House reporter for The Washington Post. Jeremy Peters, political correspondent for The New York Times. And Shannon Pettypiece, senior White House reporter for NBC News Digital. Let's start, though, with the news tonight, a short briefing. It was the curt culmination of a long week of presidential claims that were at odds with his own health officials. Here's the backstory. The cracks began to show on Tuesday when Robert Redfield, director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, told the Washington Post that a simultaneous flu and coronavirus outbreak in the fall and winter will actually be even more difficult than the one we went through, and said calls to liberate states from stay-at-home orders were, quote, not helpful. The president then said Redfield had been misquoted, but Redfield on Wednesday said he had been correctly quoted as the president looked on.
Dr. Robert Redfield was totally misquoted in the media on a statement about the fall season and the virus. Totally misquoted.
You were accurately quoted, correct?
I'm accurately quoted in the Washington Post as difficult.
Another flare-up came later Wednesday when Rick Bright, a senior government scientist working on a vaccine, said he was removed from his post for resisting efforts to promote hydroxychloroquine, an anti-malaria drug that has been used by some doctors to treat the virus. The president has been touting that drug for weeks, encouraged by conservative commentators, but earlier today, Friday, the Food and Drug Administration warned that people should not take the drug to treat COVID-19 outside of a hospital or formal clinical trial due to reports of heart issues. But it was Thursday's news conference that remains the most debated moment of this week. The president expressed hope about the power of sunlight to defeat the virus and turned to a science administrator from the Department of Homeland Security to explore the idea. And he theorized about what he called disinfectants.
I would like you to speak to the medical doctors to see if there's any way that you can apply light and heat to cure. And again, I say maybe you can, maybe you can't. I'm not a doctor.
But sir, you're the president.
Deborah, have you ever heard of that? The heat and the light relative to certain viruses, yes, but relative to this virus?
That is a treatment. I mean, certainly fever is a good thing when you have a fever. It helps your body respond. But not as I've not seen heat or light.
I think it's a great thing to look at. And I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning?
By Friday morning, bleach companies issued a statement warning against improper use of their products. And later today, the president responded.
I was asking a very sarcastic question to the reporters in the room about disinfectant on the inside.
Shannon, you just came back from the White House to join us tonight, and the reason we wanted to lay that all out is to understand how we got here tonight to this short briefing, no questions, the president not engaging, at least tonight, anymore about hydroxychloroquine, about disinfectants. What explains the president tonight deciding not to take questions and to continue to push the issues he was pushing on Thursday?
Well, for weeks, the president's advisors have been telling him to cool it on these briefings, that they are not helping him politically, and the numbers really reflect that. They just continue getting worse and worse for him when you look at his approval rating, when you look at the number of Americans who trust him to get accurate information. They are not good. So his advisors have been telling him to cut these back, do fewer of them, spend less time out there. And I think this disinfectant light briefing we had on Thursday was really the culmination or the case in point of what his advisors are trying to tell him. They did not want to be spending today talking about whether or not the president told people to inject themselves with bleach, or whether or not light could kill. You could put a light inside someone's virus to kill it off. That is not what they wanted to be talking about today. And instead, they spent the entire day trying to clean this up. It started in the morning with the press secretary accusing the media of misquoting the president then saying that he was being sarcastic. Even Deborah Birx went out. She taped an interview that's going to air tomorrow on Fox. She came out and said that this was just the president sort of publicly musing and having a dialogue with scientists, but in front of the entire public. So the reaction tonight, at least I'll tell you, is officials are hopeful that the president is going to cut back on these briefings going forward and finally listen to their advice. But listen, nothing's over until it's over.
So based on Shannon's reporting, Nancy, we're seeing a political calculation at the White House to try to pull the president back from some of these statements, but there is a health cost to when the president does this. Maryland, the state, it issued a statement saying, please, to its residents, do not use disinfectants on your own body. And you engaged today at the news conference with Speaker Pelosi, who raised health concerns.
That's right. And, what she said is that obviously people should not be injecting Lysol into their lungs. Yet another statement we never expected that anyone would have to make. But this is, this goes beyond sarcasm, obviously. This is junk science, and it's a problem because this is a time when Americans need facts from their government more than ever. And it wasn't just Maryland. It was public health departments all around the country who put out statements, who tweeted telling people not to consider doing this. And the reason that they felt they had to do that, Robert, is because they were getting so many questions from citizens. So, you can sort of laugh it off, but this has real world implications when you've got millions of people watching these briefings and wondering whether they should take this advice seriously.
Jeremy, you've been tracking conservatives at different news outlets as they've aligned themselves with the president on hydroxychloroquine and on other issues. What does your reporting reveal on that front?
It's interesting because if you had experienced the story of the president's remarks yesterday in the briefing through conservative media, you either would not have known that he said it, or you would have received a very sanitized version of those remarks. Earlier today on Fox News, I happened to be listening to the way they were covering this, and the editing of what the president said would have left you with the impression that he was taken out of context, that indeed he could have been talking about a life-saving experimental measure to use light to kill the virus. So I really think when all is said and done, the political divides in this country are being imposed on the real scientific conversations, medical issues that have to do with this virus in a way that is going to reflect very poorly on this country's political discourse. You essentially have the culture wars in America colliding with this global health crisis. And that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing for the people who are sick. And it's not a good thing for people who are trying to prevent themselves from getting sick. I mean, the idea of a medication, a debate over medication entering a political context is really kind of uncharted territory for us.
And it's been an uncharted territory, Tolu, since the early 1960s. You think back to President Kennedy in 1962, making sure through the amendment to the Food and Drug Safety Act that drugs would be approved by the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, that they're both safe and efficacious. When you report on this culture inside of the administration, and you see Dr. Bright, his challenges with the president and the president's advisors, you also saw FDA Commissioner Stephen Hahn at the White House today standing next to the president, making a few remarks. What are you hearing from your sources about whether health experts, whether it's Commissioner Hahn or it's Dr. Birx, feel pressure to go along with the president's beliefs over science?
Well, they do. I mean, President Trump said it himself that he's not a doctor, but he pointed to his brain and he basically said that he has the information that he needs in order to direct the federal health response to this pandemic. It's very clear that the president wants to play a central role, overruling his doctors, talking up drugs that have not been vetted, talking about treatments that have not been vetted that are on their face sort of laughable when it comes to things like using light inside people's bodies or using disinfectants inside people's bodies to try to get rid of a virus that very many experts, medical experts, scientific experts around the world are trying to figure out ways to get rid of this virus. And the idea that the president, who has no medical expertise, would just sort of come up with something on the top of his head and it would work, it may convince his supporters, but it does not actually carry much weight in the scientific community, and it does not actually work when it comes to actually trying to get rid of this virus. So all of these experts are trying to tiptoe around the president. They're trying to explain away his comments. They're trying to figure out ways to work with him, work with his very unique personality, but it has been difficult. We have seen people like Dr. Bright getting pushed out of the administration. We've seen people like Dr. Birx and Dr. Fauci trying to figure out ways to convince the president, stay on his good side, not badmouth him too much so that they would listen to him when they bring various recommendations. But it has been difficult. The president has put a lot of pressure on his medical experts, and that's why we've seen such a disjointed response from the White House and from the administration.
Nancy, to that point, Congresswoman Anna Eshoo of California announced today that she's going to try to call Dr. Bright to come testify about his experience. He wants to be a whistleblower. Will House Democrats pursue investigations on all of these issues?
Yes, I asked Pelosi about that in her press conference, and she said absolutely. And here's where the real world situation creates some logistical challenges. If we were living in normal times, you can be sure that the House would have already scheduled a hearing featuring Dr. Bright. They would want to haul him before Congress and before Anna Eshoo's committee as quickly as possible to hear what he has to say. But at this point, we're in this limbo where we believe that the House will come back to Washington on May 4th, but that is pending the decisions by not just officials here in the District of Columbia, but also the Capitol physician and the Sergeant at Arms. So this is a decision that's being made in concert. If all of those individuals decide it's not safe for lawmakers to come back to Washington yet, even though many of them want to, then that date will get pushed off again, and some of the urgency here will be lost. As you know, Robert, there was a lot of discussion over the last couple of weeks about perhaps enabling House members to hold hearings remotely. The technology exists to allow them to do that, but there's been a lot of debate over whether that's a good idea, whether they could do it securely and safely, and it's been tied to the issue of remote voting, which is also very controversial, and so that's kind of gotten punted for now, which means it could be weeks before Dr. Bright comes and speaks to Congress.
But do you think he could come to testify this summer or sometime?
It sounds like he's very interested in telling his story, and certainly House Democrats are very eager to hear it. So I think that, as long as the House is back here in Washington in session, I think it appears that both sides are eager to make that happen as quickly as possible.
Shannon, one final question on this particular issue. Hydroxychloroquine, the FDA issued a statement, a warning about it. You have the president touting a lab study about sunlight. It has not been peer-reviewed. I know you said the political advisors are saying, hey, Mr. President, maybe enough with the news conferences, but is he going to pull back at all from making statements that are not approved or supported by the FDA about drugs and about treatments?
Well, I will say it's been about 2 weeks since he talked about hydroxychloroquine publicly at one of these briefings. He raised it at a briefing about 2 weeks ago. He had some coronavirus survivors who came into the cabinet room, and a couple of them said that they had taken it, but that was pretty much it. And since then, there has been a chip of stories raising, and studies, I mean, not stories, but actual medical studies raising questions about this. The FDA put out a statement cautioning people not to use this outside the medical setting. The FDA commissioner was at the briefing tonight. He talked about a test that had been approved, but made no mention of this new warning from the FDA about hydroxychloroquine. It has not been talked about on Fox News very much. There's been some analysis that shows that conversation dropping off. So I think on this front, the White House is really trying to distance themselves from that. But of course, as we saw in the briefing with the light and the disinfectant, I think the president sometimes just can't help himself from wanting to try and go down the path of a miracle cure. He also talked about this week about a vaccine coming very soon, which it is not. But again, trying to get into Dr. Trump mindset, and we continue to see that.
So the briefing is the big story in Washington for political reporters most days, but the big story for almost every American is their own situation, the economy, what's going on with their bank account, their family, and more than 4 million Americans filed for unemployment last week, and since mid-March, more than 26 million people have been laid off or furloughed, and the Washington Post noted that jobless figures on this scale have not been seen since the Great Depression. Congress responded to this economic pain by passing a $484 billion aid package this week. Here's what you need to know. In short, it includes $300 billion for the depleted small business lending program. It has $75 billion for hospitals, and it includes $25 billion for virus testing. Absent from the deal was the $500 billion sought by governors, many of them facing budget shortfalls. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, a Republican, firmly opposed that request, sparking fury from some governors. And as states grapple with these challenges and look to jumpstart their economies, some governors, like Democrat Andrew Cuomo of New York, are proceeding with caution. Cuomo was at the White House with the president this week.
Frankly, this is no time to act stupidly, period. I get the pressure, I get the politics, we can't make a bad decision, and we can't be stupid about it. This is not going to be over anytime soon.
And others, like Republican Brian Kemp of Georgia, are plowing ahead with plans to reopen restaurants, barbershops, and other businesses. Governor Kemp's move came after pressure from conservatives and drew a rebuke from Atlanta's mayor and health experts, and this from President Trump.
I told the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, that I disagree strongly with his decision to open certain facilities which are in violation of the Phase 1 guidelines. At the same time, he must do what he thinks is right. I want him to do what he thinks is right. But I disagree with him on what he's doing.
Nancy, how much of a hard line is McConnell, the majority leader, taking on this upcoming negotiation? Will he yield at some point on aid to states? We have seen him back away from some of his positions in these previous rounds of talks.
I think you're really onto something there, Robert. You've watched him conduct these negotiations in the past, and he's a savvy negotiator, and he knows that if he stakes out a bargaining position in the beginning where it looks like it's only Democrats who want this state funding, that then he can go ahead and give it to them and then say, well, I've given you what you want, and now here's what I want. When the reality is, frankly, that many Republicans, along with Democrats, know that states are going to need another bailout. I mean, their revenue is shrinking rapidly, even as they are spending more to combat this crisis, and Democratic and Republican governors are alike are beating down the door telling Congress that they are going to need these funds. So I'm not sure that McConnell is going to stick to this position, but clearly as Congress kind of revs up for the next big negotiation over a CARES 2 package or Phase 4, whatever you want to call it, that is going to be a big part of it. And he's trying to find a negotiating position that's going to enable him to get the things he wants in that package at the end of the day.
Tolu, you just filed the story for the Post about Governor Kemp and President Trump. What is the real story behind the scenes? He's aligned with the president, yet now at odds with the president.
Yeah, Governor Kemp really owes a lot of his governorship to President Trump's endorsement. He was able to propel himself to the top of the ticket on the Republican primary back in 2018, thanks to Trump. But since he took office, he's clashed with the president on a number of issues, including his appointment of Kelly Loeffler as the new senator in Georgia. President Trump wanted his fierce defender, Doug Collins, a representative, to be appointed to that Senate seat. And now we see them clashing over the opening up of Georgia. President Trump actually seemed to be very much in favor of the fact that Georgia was going to open up very aggressively and very quickly as late as last week and early this week. But after there was some pushback to Governor Kemp's announcement that spas and tattoo parlors and bowling alleys would be included, and some of the medical experts said that that was not in line with what they had recommended. That was actually in direct contrast to President Trump's own guidelines, which the president at times has seemed somewhat unfamiliar with. The president decided to publicly rebuke Governor Kemp, surprising the governor's aides. So this is something that the governor was not expecting after speaking to President Trump. But he criticized him on Wednesday. He doubled down on it on Thursday, saying he was not happy with how Governor Kemp was handling this. We reported at the Washington Post that President Trump had called Governor Kemp and asked him to modify his order, take off some of the spas and nail salons, and Governor Kemp declined. He said that he was going to move forward, and that clash is continuing between a top Republican governor and the Republican president.
What about the clash, Jeremy, in the activist ranks? You've covered the Tea Party for years, and you just said earlier in the show about this being a culture war. We saw thousands at the Wisconsin State Capitol Friday. Is there a new Tea Party type movement emerging on the right to pressure some of these governors?
Yeah, I think there absolutely is an element of the conservative base that is unhappy with these restrictions. I think, though, the question is, like, what type of conservatism does that represent? And is that brand of conservatism dead because of the coronavirus? And I think this is something I hear a lot of my sources talking about. The answer is free market conservatism right now is on life support. It's an ideology that Republicans have really no use for, and there's almost zero political will from the people to see those types of policies enacted. Small government, free market conservatism really has no role in this type of environment. And so when you see these protesters, yes, you're right, there are thousands in Michigan, Kentucky, there were hundreds.
But you're right, they've been pretty small. They've been pretty small.
By and large, they have been pretty small and really fringy. If you look at the crowds, it's people waving Confederate flags, carrying semi-automatic weapons. This is not an outpouring like we saw, like you and I covered in 2009 and 2010. I do think, though, there is a difference between that type of uprising and revolt, which is fairly contained, and the type that you could see slowly bubbling up. I wouldn't quite call it a revolt, but I would say, as people have described it to me, patience is fraying. There are people who have been home now for weeks. Their kids are getting
They're getting restless. They're getting restless.
Exactly. And this is
exactly. Hey, Jeremy, give me 1 second here. We just want to get Shannon in real quick. Sure. Speaking of all the fight on the right, Shannon, we see the president pushing ahead on immigration. Is that going to continue with more executive orders? We only have about 30 seconds left.
Yeah, I think that was a way to get the topic back into his comfortable turf. Right now, he had wanted to be talking about things like immigration, and he can't because of coronavirus. So it was a way to get the conversation back on his friendly turf on a #1 issue for Republicans, and to also paint this theoretical picture of a future where there are so many jobs that immigrants are flooding here to get them. It's part of that hope, spin the thing forward and make people think that things are going to be better than reality actually indicates they will be.
That's all the time we have. Packing it all into 30 minutes is not easy on weeks like this, but thank you very much to our reporters, Nancy Cordes, Toluse Olorunnipa, Jeremy Peters, and Shannon Pettypiece. And thank you for joining us. We will keep taking you as close to the news as we can. Our conversation will continue online on our Extra. Find it on our social media and our website. This week's topic, the 2020 campaign. I'm Robert Costa. Good night from Washington.